Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game.
Got board game.
I got board game. I am Ben,
I'm John.
and today we are back with another first impressions video. You might see a few of these more recently just because only now are we starting to actually play board games in person. So showing some of my friends new games finally after like a whole year, basically. And so getting those games in, but still only playing, once or twice. So getting first impressions down in these kind of videos for you guys. And so today, one of the games that, at least with John, I feel like we've talked a lot about, or more than most games recently. And that game that we're gonna get first impressions on is
Red Rising.
Red Rising.
Which, if you've been following, there was another first impressions video that was done previously by Ben
and Daniel. Yeah, so we do on this channel, we did do that other video already, and so today's will just be John's first impressions, so just him. And so you might hear, like his first impression after playing it just once, right, for the first time the other weekend.
Yep.
But then you also might hear some of his thoughts on maybe some of the things Daniel and I brought up in our first impressions video. And then we're gonna rip into each other at that point.
and go our separate ways forever.
John Got Board Game will be a new channel after.
John's got better board games. No.
Okay.
Just kidding.
And so so that's just to let you guys know, we'll be covering John's first impressions of Red Rising today. And so to get into it, just to jump in and start getting your thoughts on it, was there anything you wanted to say first off the back of your first impressions?
Oh, well, I mean, do we want to describe the game a little bit for people? Or
so if you guys haven't seen other videos, in this one, I mean, I'm still not going to do like, the usual quick overview of rules and how it goes through. That'll be when we do a full-on review. But overall, Red Rising is a game by Stonemaier Games that can play, I believe, 1 to 6 players. And it's set in this Red Rising universe, which is a fiction series, young adult book series by Pierce Brown, in this kind of dystopian world where there is this color class system, with red being the lowest, all the way up to golds being the elites. And so for the purpose of this game, there is basically a whole deck of cards, which are the people in this world. And so there's, cards for characters who are reds and oranges and greens, all the way to silvers and golds. And then on the cards, they all function differently. They all have like a point value. They have an ability for when you play them to a certain location. The board just has a few locations that you could play cards to. When you play them to a location, the card might activate its ability. And then the main thing with the cards is that they have a certain way of scoring you bonus points, in addition to the points already on the cards themselves. And so I might show some of those while John is talking, but just kind of keep that in mind right now. The whole game is about then comboing the cards you're holding on to at the end of the game, because during the game, you're just basically playing a card, doing its ability, and picking up a card from a different location. So you're kind of cycling your hand of cards to end up with all the cards you want to combo in a way to get you the most points. And there's some other things such as the locations where you pick up characters from. You activate the location's abilities, which are different ways of getting points, such as getting helium, which is a kind of a point resource. And then there's like a fleet track, like your outer spaceship fleet, that you move up on for points. And then the Institute, which also grants points based on how much influence you end up having there. And so yeah, so you just take turns trying to take actions to cycle cards. Whoever ends up with the most points based on how all the cards combo and the other tracks they moved up on will win.
Yeah.
So with that, hopefully that gives you an idea. And again, we did kind of cover it a little bit in our preview
Yes.
video of this, which we also did even before the I believe I did an unboxing maybe too.
I think you did an unboxing and
Yeah.
you did your first.
And yeah. So more videos on this game than usual. But yeah, throughout those, we do touch upon all these kind of same mechanics that are in the game. So you can even check those for those maybe some more details. But then getting into it then, John, was there any initial thoughts you wanted to say about your first impressions?
Oh yeah, so I will say, so I remember when we did the preview video, I was pretty interested in the concept of the game and how it played. I did watch one of the Let's Play videos by one of the groups of the game that was displayed on their Kickstarter. I would say I was pretty excited because I was very interested in the way that the cards and kind of this kind of big focus on the fact that, as we were mentioning, there's a lot of cards that are based on the novel or on the novel series. I didn't read. I don't have vested interest in the novel series. I haven't read it at all. I have no real idea. I only heard about it because of the game when Ben recommended it or kind of noted that this is a game that we're looking forward to. But the fact that I did note or see that there was 14 different factions of colors in the game. So like, it's not just like a rainbow of maybe 4 or 5 or 6 different colors. It's 14 different, faction colors. And one of the things that was really espoused was the fact that every faction, like all of the factions, has unique powers or unique characteristics to the particular color, right? In association with the fact of the book, which, as was mentioned, is a dystopian universe, and it is kind of a, if you think of, I think other dystopian books like, what do you call it? Like the Hunger Games, where there's kind of a stratification of classes. This book series, like this dystopian universe, is that stratification of classes through like your associated color. Right. So as Ben was mentioning, like red is in the book the lowest class, which is why it's Red Rising. So you can probably guess what the theme is of the series. And then like the top classes being these like special metallic colors of like silver, gold, like these high standing colors, or colors that are kind of from a like our culture or like from Western culture and stuff associated with like precious or special colors, and I believe it follows that same or similar color stratification. But from a first impressions, when I did play the game with Ben, so interested, I actually technically didn't even start the game with Ben. We watched the friends start the game. So it was Ben and a few of our other friends who actually were officially starting the game. So, and we were doing, it was a 4-player game, but then they had to leave. So we ended up taking over after a few, like 2 or 3 turns into the game. We were able to take over for them to play. I would say I enjoyed the game very much. That's my first impression. I thought it was very, overall, I think it's a well done and it's a well-made game in what I believe they set out to do, right? The whole concept of the characters, the utilization of cards, and bringing their effects into play, playing to the strengths of these particular colors or aiming for certain colors to gain victory points, and then trying to achieve the highest score possible. So another thing about this game is it is ultimately a Euro game in the sense of it's a point collection game. You are trying to get the highest, collect the most points and get the highest score at the end of the game. And so through that, we kind of mentioned there's a number of different ways of doing it, achieving certain goals that are on the board that you're kind of accumulating these resources or influence over time. And through, as Ben mentioned, the actual the character cards themselves that you'll be using in your hand, which is another really interesting component of the game, is the fact that you have to both, at the end of the game, plan out the cards in your hand to be, to try to get the best or the highest scores possible. Yet these cards are the resources you need to utilize in game in order to continue achieving your points or to reach the end end state of this game. So yeah, so I really enjoyed the game. In that game, I did end up winning. And not only did I win, I also broke the 300-point score barrier. I actually miscalculated and I thought I didn't, but then I realized I miscounted one of my cards, so I actually did. So
He
haha.
only likes the game because he won.
So I won and I broke I broke the score barrier that they said is a good score in the rules. So
So yeah, it's not
Victory.
necessarily a good game. He just won. So that's why.
No, but I actually do think that the game is a really well thought out game. So as we mentioned, so kind of going into the mechanics as Ben had mentioned, I think it's a pretty clever way of kind of in a lot of games where you're collecting points, especially when they're utilizing cards in a game. I think especially of deck builder style games is when you're collecting or when you're trying to get points into your system, typically what happens is you'll like these resources or the cards that you use or the way that you act in a game where you're trying to collect or get kind of sets of cards is that once you kind of get these sets or once you get these certain kind of types of cards, you're either incentivized not to use them or you're incentivized to or they do absolutely nothing in your hands, right? So like think of old like deck builders like Dominion. The way that you get points is buying like these particular kind of, I think duchy cards or
Duchies and
these kind of like
provinces.
estate locations that do nothing. Like they you need them at the end of the game because that's what gives you points, but they do absolutely nothing for you in the game itself, right? Or in like set collection games where it's like once you collect a set of cards, you kind of set them aside, right? So any kind of game where you're collecting sets, you just put them on the side once you've collected them, and then you just start using different cards or new cards. I think the cool thing and the interesting thing about this game is the fact that those cards that really in the way that we played the game, or at least when we saw the end scores, is the cards are really the bulk of the scores that you're going to be making in this game, which I also think kind of fits thematically into the game, right? In the sense of, right, this is based on this book series about the class tensions and the differentiations of who's kind of rising to power, who's kind of the stronger class or the best class in the end. And the fact that it's these class cards are the ones that really get you those points to win is in that sense that set collection that we were talking about, or like I was just mentioning. But the interesting thing is in this game, you have to also be very careful about maybe holding on to these cards too much or overvaluing certain classes or certain colors, because those cards themselves may actually have particular powers or particular things that you need to do that will elevate you in the game, whether it's to end the game faster because you know or you have a sense that you might be leading in the game, or to try to push yourself to try to get the lead or try to get into the lead based on that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so like this idea of the hand of cards you have at the end being and trying to get them to combo, right?
Mhm.
Getting the cards that combo, but through this cycling idea. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, I've said in other videos that that's like the main way I would describe the key mechanic of the game, right?
Mhm.
Knowing how to cycle your cards, what to play on one turn, and hopefully be available to pick up on another turn or
Mhm.
on that same turn. But keeping an awareness of that, like maybe this is the time for me to play this and pick up that card. Like, how did you feel about that
Mhm.
specific mechanism in the
Yeah,
game?
yeah. So then in speaking to the actual playing mechanic of it, I think that that is a really clever way of playing the game. And it's been described in the other kind of videos and stuff as well. But in your turn, you kind of have two primary actions. But the main mechanic that most people are using throughout the game is you're taking one of those cards in your hand, you're playing it on one of four locations. There's four planets. I forget the planets like Mars,
Like yeah,
Jupiter,
Luna, Mars,
Luna,
Jupiter, and
and some
the
more.
Institute. Or let me
Or the Institute.
open
Yeah,
this
it's
up.
oh,
Yeah,
there
the
we are.
Institute.
He's gonna show the board. There you go. Yeah, the Institute, Mars, Jupiter, and Luna. Yeah, so those are the
Mhm.
four primary locations that you can be placing. So on your turn, you're going to be taking one of the cards in your hand and you're going to be playing one of them onto the field into one of those four planets or areas. And so by placing your card there, you get to enact or utilize the power of the character card that you played, which will do whatever bonus, whether it's potentially drawing more cards, whether it's getting more resources. It could be removing cards from the board, other cards from the board. There's some that are gambling in a way where you're kind of drawing from the deck of other character cards and kind of doing a guess of trying to see if you can get a new card or a specialized card. There's all kinds of different mechanics on how they play out. Some of them discard others or let you kind of transfer. So there's tons of different ways in which these cards, depending on the colors and depending on what their powers actually say for them to do, that will interact with each other, whether it's on the board, whether it's on the about the resources. That's kind of where a lot of the complexity of the cards comes into effect, which I think is really interesting. So first you place it, which is also important because you're adding that card onto the tableau, which then goes to the second part of that action phase, which is taking the top character on that in that planet location or in those locations. You take one of the other ones that of the location you did not place, or I believe the term is deploy upon in that space. So for example, if I deployed my character onto the Institute area, which is the green one, when I'm picking up a card, I cannot pick up from that location, which I think for, if you really think about it from a gamer term, or you just think mechanically, is basically you can't just pick up the same card that you play over and over and over again, right? So you can't benefit utilizing the same power over and over. It's basically say you got to pick up something different or something new, right? So then you have to pick it up from one of the other locations that are there. But it's not just about picking up a character. It's also by picking up a character from that location, there's a secondary action that's involved with that, which is you pick up that particular character card and the location will do something. So 3 of the 4 locations are basically part of the board tracker, which I believe the blue one, Jupiter, is you get to move your fleet token forward 1 space. The Mars token is the red one, which allows you to mine helium, which is a red token, a separate token. The green one is the Institute, where you get to take one of the influences that you have on your character sheet or your play area, place it into that little green box on the top of the board. And then the yellow one is you get to take the Sovereign token, which indicates that you are, I guess, the sovereign in that space. And then all of the players have an associated sovereign bonus, where when you take the token, you get to enact and do something special, whether it's gain additional resources, or you may be able to look at new cards that are coming up and place them into the tableau, or there's a dice that's in the game, or die that's in the game, where you get to roll the die and then you get to do an associated action based on the die roll. So that Luna token does its own thing, and then that Sovereign token at the end of the game is also worth victory points and may also play with some of the other character cards that you may be holding in your hand as well, positively or negatively, depending on the card. I found that mechanic really interesting because that to me is the bread and butter of this whole game, right? Without that mechanic, this game would suck. In all honesty, this would not be a fun game. But I think it's really interesting because it's a combination of thinking about playing your character, of utilizing the powers and determining whether or not you want to use them from your hand or not, right? It's like, I could use this power, but I also know that it could be worth a lot of points for me because I have 3 other cards in my hand that synergize with it, or maybe I don't have them yet, but I see them on the board. And if I use it now, I may not be able to pick them up later when I get those cards, right? So in that way, there's already an element of thinking about how your cards synergize with each other to try to get the most points at the end of the game. However, in addition to that, where you place your characters is also really important in this game too. And I don't know if that's been emphasized or thought about as much, or at least is something that's really something I appreciated a lot in this game, because where you place your characters will determine kind of where other people may or may not decide to pick up that character. So for example, let's say in the game, or actually a case in point in the game that we were all playing the last time we played in that game, three of us, Ben, myself, and my wife, who was playing for one of the other replaced players, we all were kind of gathering the institute a lot. We were all kind of trying to race to place our influence in the institute, as fast as possible and try to have the highest number of influence in there, because you actually get more points if you're higher, if you have the most institute points at the end of the game. You have a multiplier bonus to that kind of tracker increase. So we were all racing for that. But one of the things that I noticed as we were playing is there's a certain point where you can run out of characters that are in that location, right? And so, as I mentioned, is the only way for you to activate the bonus of that location is by picking up a character from that location itself, right? So it's not about placing a character there; it's about picking up a character from there. And so there was a point in time during the game where I realized we ran out of characters because no one was placing characters there anymore. I think the other player that wasn't racing had shifted every single character
Mm.
out of that location. They used one of the powers and they basically moved everybody out of that area. So then what happened was we ran out of people to place, or we ran out of people to take from there, which meant that we no longer could put influence into the influence tracker through that means right away. So there's a trade-off where you have to start thinking about, where exactly am I going to put my person? Because if I place him there, or him or her there, I may be giving my opponents the opportunity or the possibility of being able to now pick up that character. So maybe not only could it be a character that maybe is decently strong or may have some good influence or powers, but like the person can both pick up that good power and get the influence, which I'm already like racing against that person for. So I have to think about, okay, maybe I need to place my character somewhere else. But if I place him somewhere else, that means that I'm not going to be able to pick up from that location. So if I place it on Jupiter, for example, I can't pick up from Jupiter, which means I can't move my fleet tracker. But one of the things we didn't talk about is the end of the game is, of those trackers that you're placing, either the influence or the resources that you're gathering or moving on the fleet tracker, you have to reach a certain milestone or a certain marker on each of those, right? So basically all three of them have to be met by all of the players combined, or one player has reached two of those trackers to the particular limit, by themselves. And then that will trigger the end state of the game. So you need to be doing these actions over time in order to trigger the end state of the game. But if you block yourself or prevent yourself from picking up from there, it could be a problem too, right? So there's a lot of that goes into the game. And then there's even the added complexity if you think about where you're placing your character on these locations. Is this a location, like I know this is a good character power, or maybe like I know that like Ben is collecting a certain color and I'm using one of those colors powers, but what if I place it in a location that he doesn't really need to get resources for, right? Like maybe he's already maxed out his fleet tracker or institute tracker. Then I'm like, maybe I can place my guy over there, or maybe I know he's not interested in racing there because he's so far behind, right? Because other people, he's been focusing on something else. So then it's like, maybe I should place him there instead, because I know at the very least, maybe he won't be incentivized to pick up that because it doesn't fit into his plan, right? So it's also kind of thinking about and seeing on the board state, what are other people collecting and what are other people utilizing in order to kind of like help you stay ahead of everybody else, right? So I think that part is also a really interesting part of this game, of this balance of the importance of these colors and the importance of picking up these cards, but also thinking about where you're placing these influences and effect of these different colors locations to maybe dissuade your opponents from picking them up. Or another thing too is layering on top of a card that you're pretty sure your opponents want. You can place a card on top of it and basically be like, haha, no one can take it until they take that card that's on top of it first, right? Which kind of buries the cards away to also kind of either prevent people from using kind of overpowered combinations that maybe they keep using over and over, or just like, I don't want anybody else to use this, so I'm just going to get rid of this. And then of course there are certain character cards, as we mentioned, that have the ability of pulling things out of the ones that are under others, but again, you would need those particular cards. So it's all about kind of those balances. So
And so with all those kind of possibilities you mentioned, at least on the abilities on
yeah.
the specific cards, like when you
Yeah.
play them or
Mhm.
deploy them, going a little deeper on that small detail is I believe Daniel had mentioned in our first impressions video that
Mhm.
at least theme wise, he didn't feel the theme because, like you would have green characters who are engineers, but then each engineer card was like a different ability,
Mhm.
and so what did you think about that? Like, would it have been better if, like, all the characters in a certain color had the same ability, or did it feel good that they were all different pretty much, or did you even feel like even though they were different they still were similar in some way that made them feel thematic?
And that's the thing. I think they are similar in a way that feels thematic, and I think that's the part that I mean, again, and I think this is also something that you two brought up in your first impressions, and I do think maybe is a critical issue of the game is there was only so many cards that we did actually get to play through in the end, right? So there is a deck, and it's like a huge deck of cards of character cards that are in it. But in real, in like ultimately, I feel like you really only play depending on I think one, it depends on the number of players you have, but it typically feels like maybe you only play 25% of the actual deck in total of
Mm.
all of the cards that are there. So a pro to that is there's a lot of replayability because there's probably a ton of cards that you didn't see. But a con of the game too is like there's a ton of cards that you probably will not see in the course of the gameplay, which is kind of like part of this game is about, and this is one of the pros that I have is like the fact that there does feel like there's a lot of relationship of cards and the needing of managing those relationships or like the synergies between these cards to really get the best points. And I think that's a really strong point of favor in this game because to me that feels thematic to the series, at least from the little I know about the series, from the little that Ben's told me about the series in all of these videos. But the getting kind of back to that point of the themes of the colors, I actually did feel like the cards really had these really interesting synergies and feels to them. So for example, like the green cards, I believe you were saying were the engineering cards, and the engineering cards I noted, or maybe I'm thinking of the purple, I forget which one, and maybe I'm wrong about this, so maybe I'm thinking about the name, but I believe the engineer cards had to do with gambling, or maybe that was the particular one that I had. But I feel like the green ones typically had to do with like gambling in the sense of deck manipulation and looking through and finding and trying to get more cards, right? Different kinds of cards, different types of cards, different player cards throughout, right? In terms of supporting and kind of if you're thinking of an engineer in the society, they support all of the classes. They support all of the people in all of these different ways and how they work and operate with each other, right? In the whole space. They're not going to have significant allegiances to the top or to the bottom because they just need to make the society run and function. So they're going to have relationships with everybody. And so by the virtue of that, they're engineered in that way to help you get connected or get to different cards or different character cards. I don't know if that fits in with like the way the engineers actually play in the series itself because I've never read the series, but at least for me, it felt like all the green cards did something to that effect, which allowed me to play along with them.
Mhm.
Then there was the orange cards, which I forget what their class was officially called, but the orange cards were very kind of clearly noted as cards that allowed you to move characters around on the board itself, right? So like if I place an orange in a particular location, it would allow me to move other colors into that location with the orange. Or if I put the orange somewhere, it would move them out of that location into a different location. So it felt like from a thematic standpoint as the orange color, those cards were utilized and made to move characters throughout. Then I think with the red ones, there was a really interesting synergy that I saw with those where the red cards, being the lowest class, were typically associated with working together with other reds because they had to stay together if you think about that in that way. And they also had negative synergies with the higher classes and the upper classes, especially the golds, because golds are at the top and they're the ones who oppress, right? The reds. So there's negative synergies that happen regularly with those. And the reds also were typically associated with mining, which I believe is a part of kind of the dystopian society, that the reds were also in charge of like getting the helium in
Mm.
some capacity or in some way. And so there were a lot of synergies that I saw. The few red cards that I got that had to do with the number of heliums or allowing me to get more helium if I utilize them in certain ways in that way.
So
So
you thought all of that worked out well then.
yeah, so in my opinion, I think it does fit really well, or at least because whatever cards we had, I saw the synergies happen and occur pretty regularly. And not just that, I also felt like all the characters were pretty unique. And while I don't know the story, it did feel like there were certain cards that were unique in even within their own classes that I could kind of tell, like if I read the book, I'd probably have an idea of what that character was going to be doing in
Mm.
that. So for example, one of the cards that I played a lot in that game was this obsidian card, so the black cards, which are assassins, right? So typically all of the assassin cards can destroy or just get rid of other cards in the board, and usually typically associated with particular colors. The black card that I had though was actually an obsidian card that was used to kill other obsidians. Yeah, that's the one. The stained. So both by his name, stained, as well as his power, which was banishing other, like you could banish any card. You could assassinate anyone. But if you basically assassinated other assassins, you would gain something special, and specifically the Institute, right? So even thinking thematically, it kind of for me felt like this character is pretty interesting because he's probably something that is fitting to the Institute of like these green cards, or at least associated with this, kind of thought of influence and knowledge and such. And he's also like an assassin killer as well, right? Where I don't know if like in the book, if I read it, like there maybe like he's like maybe a failed experiment and now he's like going on his own, or like the Institute has its own agenda that they're doing and they're basically trying to get rid of the other assassins in the world, or kind of hiding maybe their own secret objectives that they're trying to do compared to the rest of their society, right? Like the character itself, like it felt like it was different. And then there was other assassins that like did different things, right? There was some that like if you killed other certain colors in a certain location, you gained helium, or you gained, fleet tracker movement and stuff. So it kind of like in that way, it told to me a little bit of a story in my thought of like these characters do have an interaction and a purpose based on the books, that I feel like if they made all of their powers exactly the same, or almost identical to one another, you would have lost a lot of the ingenuity and creativity of the individual characters. And I think again, like as a part of the theme and the stylization of the mechanics of the game, I feel like without that, this game would be pretty boring and pretty not great,
Okay.
in my
Okay.
opinion. So,
Because I think
so I
I think
really
on
enjoyed that side. So
because I do think on the other end of it is just simply that not what Daniel said, but a different point on that is, the fact that they're all different is also what makes it maybe harder for people to jump into the game, right? Because it's
yeah,
like
my wife,
like
for her own first impression, she was kind of like, "There's too much reading in this game."
yeah, I mean that was kind of the one situation I would think of, right? For
Yeah,
anyone who's just like,
yeah.
oh, I'm drawing another green card, and it's like, oh, now I have to read a new green card because it's not
Mm.
doing what the other one did.
Yeah, and I think I had been thinking about that a lot, and this will maybe lead into a different comment that I wanted to bring up about kind of this, like the board game itself, actually, and the end state, and some stuff that I think that you and Daniel had talked about in your first impressions. Is one of the things that I really thought about and kind of found about this game is I really think that the big focus and the big direction that they wanted to take is to make sure that the interrelation, or the relationship between the cards really matched up, and really at least felt like they got the theme down in that way in this space, because this is where all the complexity of the game really comes into play, is the cards and the character cards themselves. As I said, without these character cards, this game would not, basically this would not be a game. This would kind of just be a push your luck and see if you can kind of get the fastest resources first, quickest,
Mm.
right? It's the cards that make this game the game, right? And as I said before, right, like if at the end of it when you do the scoring, the characters are the ones that really get you the most points in this game. Like the other aspects of the game will get you points and can net you some points in addition, but it's really the character cards that really push these scores up to whatever crazy numbers that we get, right? On average, I think the average scores is between 200, right? It is around 200, pushing up to good scores, as they said in the rulebook, is 300s plus, right? But that's like a really, really, really good score. You have to like max out your cards, and you have to max out the way of, of your victory points as much as possible. But it's the bulk of the cards that are the ones that are doing that, because even with the board state, I think the maximum number of points you can get, counting all of the points, is maybe like close to 100, I think, if you got all three to the maximum state, which technically you can't even do that, because as we said, the trigger for the end state of the game is not maxed out fully. It's just close to maxed out. So technically, most people are probably netting maybe 60 points from the board and for the end state game trigger, which means your remaining points need to come from elsewhere and from other things, which, as mentioned before, primarily is the cards. So I think that's from my head why the reading is a lot. It is complex in that sense, but without it, like, to me as a first impression, that is what makes this game, right? That's what makes it unique as Red Rising, as the style of game. Now moving into the board game and kind of the tracking of the resources, or in effect, or kind of the, ironically, kind of like the victory point tracking, or kind of like the end state tracking triggers. It is pretty simple, right? Like, and I think it was mentioned before. So there's 3 tracks. There's the fleet tracker, which is on the board itself. There's the institute tracker, which is on the board itself as well. And then there is collecting helium, which you bring to your own player board. But all 3 of them trigger when you get at least 7 of them in each space. So 7 institute tokens, 7 helium tokens, or you move up on the fleet tracker to 7. It is very simple. I won't lie. I think there could have been opportunities to add in scores, and maybe this is something that I don't know if they have plans for a future expansion for this game, or kind of updates or add-ons to the game that they may be adding in, or new kind of like gameplay mechanics. But it is only trying to reach 7 on these tracks, and that's all you're doing with it. I think Daniel had mentioned some other opportunities of synergies or additions to the game that could have been added, where you could maybe utilize some of those points on these trackers or movement to like gain you more points, or do additional effects with your cards, right? Like a character could maybe utilize helium and do something like draw more cards, or like
like a possible way to do something more with these
resources, right?
Yeah,
in these tracks, right? Or like you can use fleet maybe to like do something, right?
Mm-hmm. Like
or like the fact that you have so much institute knowledge, right? Like maybe triggers something for you, or allows you to do an additional thing with your actions, or something,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
And then there's a lot of other games that have done things like that where you can do it. I think they could do that. I think that would maybe make more, give more variability or differences of like why you're accumulating and why you're getting these things, versus just like passively collecting these over time as you're picking up characters as you're cycling, right, through utilizing and playing your character cards. But I also kind of see it as, without this kind of tracker mechanism in place, then the only other, like, you also have to think of how you would trigger the end state of this game, which I think this game would kind of suck if it was like after X amount of turns, the game is over kind of thing. That also feels a little bit generic and kind of arbitrary of how you want to end the game, which I think would also would not play well to this game. Though at the same time, the way that the end state is triggered is still kind of that way. One of the friends we were playing with did kind of indicate that they were done with the game, and we ended up playing for like another 30 to 45 minutes over when she was pretty much done with the game, but we didn't reach that end trigger state, which ultimately is kind of an arbitrary number, right? It's just like, why is it 7? And why does it have to be 7 of these trackers, right? Like, there's no real reason why it is other than like it gives people something to aim toward to get, right? So that is maybe a little lackluster in terms of like as a board game and as a trigger to the end state of the game. If you had incentivization of like by collecting certain numbers, like these certain numbers, you gain these, as we talked about, added bonuses or potentials of like doing something special or something different, that would incentivize players to have more of that direction of doing it versus just passively collecting it and being like, oh, well, I feel like my hand is good enough, or I feel like I'm doing well enough, so now I'm just going to try to trigger the end of the game. So,
And so, I mean, with what you've been saying mainly about the main mechanic again of the cycling and those character cards, so it sounds like you really like that whole flow
yeah,
of a turn.
yeah.
But then, aside from that, you had mentioned like, yeah, the bonuses you could get from getting the sovereign token
Yes.
from basically picking up a character from Luna. You get that token,
Yeah.
and it activates your ability. And so
Mhm.
that ability is based on your house that you're randomly dealt at the
Mhm.
beginning, right? And
Mhm.
so each one's like, one every time you get the sovereign token, you get a helium or you move up on the fleet track, right? Depending on whichever house you got. How do you feel about this part of the game? Because yeah, it sounds like you really like the main mechanic, but this is also like
Part of it.
added in,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
From the very beginning. And so like how do you feel about this part? Like, did it even need to be part of the game?
So I think it needed something in the game because there was 3 primary trackers and then you have 1 extra planet. That's kind of like, we need to do something with this planet because so I think it's important that we have 4 planets or 4 locations to place because it gives players options in terms of
Mhm.
selection of cards. And I think this game like would severely be hampered if there was only in effect 2 locations to pick from, because if you had 3 only and you only place in 1 location, you only have 2 to pick from,
Mhm,
and that
mhm.
really sucks because like your ability of selection is severely hampered. And as we talked about, there's certain cards that can move them away, so you could really be stuck with only a 1 selection if they had only gone with 1. So I think they needed to have 4, right? Or at least they needed more than 3, given
Mhm.
that there's a holder or a limiter, right? That being said, with the sovereign token, I think the sovereign token is a really cool concept. The thing that I'm a little bit unsure about, and I feel like with the first impressions, I don't know the balance of how this works, but I think 3 of the factions are specific to just by picking up the sovereign token, you immediately just gain a resource. So in
Mhm,
effect,
mhm.
what it is you're duplicating one of the other locations
Mhm,
as your
mhm.
power. Like your sovereign Luna power is duplication of another planet resource. So basically, it means that you're likely going to be the leader in that space because it is easier for you to collect those resources compared to any other player, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know how the balance is on that because the other 3 factions we played with
One of
2
them
of them.
was
We played
rolling
with
a
2 of them.
die that
Yeah.
gets a random effect,
Yeah.
which
So
could
so
be
I had the
fun.
one with the random effect die. I like that one personally. I think that's a really fun one because it's random, right? Like it's not just like I go here, I always get this all of the time. There is an element of luck and an element of gambling, which I think is fun in the game because everything else is so kind of set where it's like you're gonna get something out of picking up anywhere else. This is the only one that adds in an element of chaos to your gameplay, which I think is pretty fun. I liked that mechanic. I think that's a well balanced mechanic because it doesn't mean that I'm going to be a leader in a particular resource, but I could also luck into drawing into those resources or drawing more. I think there's one that allows you to look at the cards so I can see
Mhm,
what's coming up and I can plan accordingly with the cards I have in my hand
mhm.
or some other ones with the die. So that one was really fun. I think another one was also pretty interesting, which is the one we played with, was the player who effectively they don't have a sovereign power per se, but their power is they are the first player in the game, period. They just get to start the game first. It's not randomly selected. They just start the game first. And they end the game if it comes to their turn on the final game trigger, which is also really interesting because what it does then is oh, actually they do have a power. Never mind.
Yeah, they get to look at and
They get to look at the top
character from the
Okay, so they're not entirely sovereignless, so that's good. But it means that like they just they get foresight. They don't actually get to influence the state of the board overall, which is also pretty fun. Wait, no, they do. They get to place them out. Never mind. They do get to do stuff. So never mind. Even better.
They don't get the card, but they get to put it somewhere.
They get to place the card out. So this is also, I think, something really fun. I think it's a really interesting thing because it doesn't directly let you just win or win harder, kind of like in the way that just getting a free resource kind of lets you win fast or end the game fast. Maybe not win fast, but end the game fast. This one is more of it adds more cards into gameplay, which, as we mentioned, it's pretty limited, right? Or like it's not easy to add more cards into the game. There's not a lot of actions or a lot of direct things that players can do to add more cards other than taking an entire turn to do that, which has its pros and cons. But this particular card allows you to add more, which I think is great, right? Like anything that lets you have more variation of the player cards that are out there in the world to play around with, to manipulate, is probably better for this game. And then I don't know what the third one does because I think there's a third one, right? Because there's 3 that are resource specific and then 2 that we played with and then 1 other. Again, I don't know balance wise. I do think it's fun overall, or at least the special ones are more interesting to me. The other ones are pretty they remind me of like basic characters if you play a game. If there's a game that has like character powers or like specialized characters for players, where they're kind of like the generic like warrior, you get your +1 to attack, or I'm a mage, I get a +1 to magic, or I'm a ranger, I get a +1 to range, or whatever, right? Like those to me, like that's what those powers feel like to me. It's just like you just have a second, like you have a boosted opportunity in a particular category, but that's it, right? It doesn't do more than that, right? Like it's not like once you get to 10 institute, if you're the institute location, that you get something special if you've already reached max institute. It basically becomes another location that's kind of wasted actually, right? So again, I guess the benefit is like it pushes you to the end state of like triggering a condition, but that's it, right? So and again, we'd have to see ultimately how that affects balance, right? Because I feel like it would change your strategy depending on which one you get, which I also like in games, right? If it's like a certain power that you have as a player requires you to think of your strategy in a different way than maybe the way that you traditionally like to play a game or the traditional way you normally play a game, right?
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
But
I mean,
we would have to see what the other ones do.
I mean, I was just curious if you like having that addition or not, because of what you actually just said at the end there, that it could also direct your strategy versus just like if you didn't have it, then that main mechanic we were focusing on, like that's the only thing you would care about.
Exactly. And like I like games when they give you a push in a direction, but it's not a certainty also. Because I know like for you, for example, when we were playing in the game, like I think you had the Institute one, but you didn't really push Institute until much later, actually. And it still worked out for you because in a sense you also knew that you could race quickly to get it because you had the options to pick up from both locations. So you always had an opportunity to pick up that influence versus for me, when that Institute location ran out, I couldn't pick up from there at all. So I think that's also a pretty interesting part of that. So yeah.
So I mean, I don't know if you had other stuff on the mechanics you wanted to say, because aside from that, I just had kind of the last thoughts to get from you on the production of the game.
Yeah, so I think overall it's pretty simple production.
And I do want to point out, and I've said this in the other videos, like the version that I've been showing is the collector's edition.
Does it have a number? It has a number on it, right?
Yeah, because I am that collector number.
Yeah. Special
10,542
of the first printing.
Yeah, but the collector's edition, and so I think after checking again, the differences are there is that kind of nicer or custom insert
Yeah,
for all the pieces. There are the metal player pieces. Can't really show it well,
yeah,
but
there you
like
go.
the
For the
influence tokens,
Institute.
these cubes are metal. Um, and then it has the card holders for all the players. And then I think the last thing is that the gold character cards, the gold cards have the gold foiling, is that called like gilding?
Yeah, the gilding.
Yeah, so that's all
Foil
to,
and gilding. I forget which one they use officially, but yeah.
so that is all to the collector's edition. So kind of just that's what you played with, and so I'm
Yes.
kind of curious what you thought about, yeah, how that was produced and how it
Yeah.
felt.
So I think overall the production quality is good for what it is, right? Like it isn't a component wise, it's not a very heavy component game. Um, the Institute, cubes were nice, but honestly, like it's just a tracker. It's just a marker to indicate that you put it. It doesn't like they're just cubes. They're not themed to anything special of like, why is a cube something special for the Institute? It doesn't really have a reason. It's probably just because it's just tracking how much Institute you have, Institute influence or whatever they call it. The helium pieces are the plastic ones, or yeah, plastic, right? Like
Yeah, the
the nice
red crystal.
red crystal pieces. Though I mean, those look nice because they are kind of shaped, so they're kind of crystallized as the helium. So it's like crystallized helium. So that's pretty cool. Those components were nice. The gilding on the cards, I think that's probably the best thing in the collector's edition in terms of like the specialization and difference is just having that gilding of, I think gold and silver, I think also has the gilding as well, if I remember correctly, because I think I saw some silver cards when we
Oh,
played,
let me see.
if I remember. Maybe I'm wrong, or at least
No,
silver
it's
has
just the
another.
gold. It's just
It's
the
just the
gold.
gold, but silver also has like a really nice design that distinguishes it from gray. I think that does add to it because it definitely kind of shows like this. They are the top of the society, or like there's a very clear difference in these kinds of cards versus the other cards that you're going to see. So I like that, right? That really adds that special dimension to like this whole dystopian class conflict thing. Um, we didn't play with the card holders. They don't look that great, and it also depends on how your seating is. Like I feel like that's only good if you have one of those, like if you have seating in which everyone is kind of like
Like,
polygonally sitting away from each other. So like for example, if you're like a square, like everyone has their
oh,
clearly delineated four sides, or like a five, like a pentagonal kind of seating arrangement, because it sits flat and straight across. So it's very easy if you're not sitting in that exact kind of like not being able to see each other way of like easily kind
yeah,
of being
like if you're sitting like right next to each other, which two of our friends were,
yeah.
right,
You
sitting
can
on the
just see
same
each
side of
other's
the board,
cards, and right, like
see each other's cards. Yeah.
there's not like you can't do anything about that. Also, in addition to that, is you're going to be reading your cards a lot to remind yourself of what the powers are and how they synergize and interact with each other. And they're standard sized cards, right? So it's not like they're giant tarot cards or like the images are huge in that way. So honestly, just sitting them out there in front of you in your sitting place, unless you have like a high table, kind of like if you're sitting at a poker table, then it might be kind of like it might be okay to have them on like that style of table, or like a mahjong table or something like that, because that's how those are kind of seated to like, you know, promote that kind of look. I don't think that, like, I feel like that was kind of a throwaway component, or is just something they
Mm,
decided like, hey, like this might be cool for people to have, but they probably could have saved money in their production by not
mm.
adding those plastic things. That's just me. I don't think those add anything. I didn't use them though. Also, maybe I feel different, but most games when they have holders, they're almost never important or useful for players, right? In my opinion. I guess the only other thing about it is like by setting them on there, you're preventing people from holding them in their hand, which over time, if you keep holding cards, like people who hold cards in their hands like this, you'll bend the bottom of the cards because just by gripping a card, it slowly bends. So maybe that's why they have them for people who are that, I won't say, well, anal retentive about ensuring that their cards stay pristine. But that's just my
What are you
comment.
saying, John?
That's just my comments. This is also comes from a guy who's like cards over time and his old board games get super grody and grubby and or like worn out because we play with them so much. So
Yeah,
I'm
and
not the best
he's saying that in
person
front of a guy who tries to sleeve all his
who sleeves every single card. But yes, component wise, overall, I don't think you're missing out much for not having a collector's edition overall. I don't think that the components themselves in this game really changed the feel of this game that much, right? Like even if there was no gilding on the gold cards, if they weren't metal shapes, if it was just like wooden cubes or even acrylic cubes, that wouldn't have done anything for me in that way, really. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and just to clarify for people too, the cards are actually, I think, a size bigger than poker cards.
Oh, slightly
but
bigger,
the text is still small on it. So when it's in your card stand, like if you have a bunch of cards, you're gonna be covering them up a bit, and then you might not be able to read it anyway.
Yeah.
And so I did kind of, that is the main reason why to one of the people who checked out our Instagram the other day, I did respond that I would suggest looking into whether collector or retail edition version is actually what would be good for you, for the reasons you just pointed out in those component differences. Is it worth hunting down a collector's one and paying more for those things, And yeah, so that's
in my first impression opinion, no. There's other games that have much better collector's versions and editions in terms of what you get for having backed or kickstarted a game and things like that you could probably spend your money trying to find or hunting down that would be more valuable than this game's collector's edition. So
okay,
personally.
And so then was there anything else that you had wanted to say on your first impression?
I mean, I talked a lot about it. Ironically, this is basically my review of the game. So maybe just splice me into the next video when we do an actual review.
Yeah, just copy and paste your panel here.
Just copy it over my sound. Well, maybe you'll even cut some of my sound out. Just kidding.
No, and I'll be talking, and then your video will just play and cut me off while I'm talking.
But yeah, I think I am excited to try the game a few more times. I think there's a lot of synergies and other avenues of playing the game that I think would be pretty interested. Oh, I was going to say one of the other things is I definitely feel like this is a game that probably the best number of players is 4 players. 2 players or 3 players, I don't feel like you go through enough cards to make the game fun, which I think you and Daniel had commented on when you talked about your guys' playthrough, because you played with 3 people. Yeah. And I think that was one of the big things. With 4, I did feel like we saw a lot of cards, but I think if you did more than 4 players, while you would see a lot more cards, you would have to go through a lot more turns. And it's just the same nature of games that have the more players typically you add into the game, the longer the game will take, just by the nature of more people needing to make choices and decisions. So I feel like this game is probably best played with 4. We could see about maybe 5 if the 5th player doesn't extend it too much. But even with the 4, one of the players was already feeling that the game was too long. But I felt like maybe it was appropriate, or like, given the style of game, you should expect it to be somewhat long, or at least, with what you were doing in the game. But yeah, I would say I think the best recommended number of players is probably 4 for this game. Even though you can play up to 6 and down to 2, right?
So I had mentioned to you before this, and maybe I think in one of my comments on Instagram, that John sounds like he enjoyed this game much more than Daniel and I. So yeah, those are John's first impressions for you guys, to get a sense of why he liked it more, maybe the specific aspects of it that he just enjoys more in a game than we might, Daniel and I might. But so if you found this helpful, hope you'll share this with friends, family, people you play board games with. consider subscribing to this channel on YouTube and following us on Instagram at I Got Board Game. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.
Hey.